Colonel David Lawson was finally coming home. After 2 years of commanding military operations overseas, he was back in the familiar comfort of his hometown, Greenwood. As David drove his car down the quiet suburban streets, the peacefulness of the town wrapped around him like a warm blanket. The towering oak trees, the cozy houses, and the occasional child's bicycle left by the sidewalk all reminded him of the life he had fought to protect. Greenwood was where he had lived for over a decade with his wife, Sarah, and their teenage children, Lucas and Emily. David had missed the simple joys of family life. Morning coffee with Sarah, watching Lucas play basketball, and listening to Emily's latest piano recital. Now, he was finally back to enjoy those moments again. The town was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and the late hour gave it a tranquil, almost dreamlike quality. Sarah had texted him earlier, reminding him to pick up some groceries on his way home. David found himself smiling at the request. After years of making strategic decisions that impacted lives, a simple errand like buying groceries felt refreshing. It was a small but meaningful reminder of the normal life he was returning to. He pulled into the parking lot of the local grocery store and took a deep breath, savoring the sense of normalcy. As he walked through the aisles, selecting items from the list Sarah had sent, David couldn't help but feel grateful. The simple act of grocery shopping, something he used to take for granted, now seemed almost sacred. He loaded the bags into the trunk of his car and started his journey home, the familiar tune of a soft jazz station playing on the radio. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car parked along the curb. The rhythmic sway of the trees, the flicker of the streetlights, and the cool night air made David feel like he was the only person in the world. He was no longer Colonel Lawson, commanding troops in a foreign land. He was just David, a husband, a father, a neighbor. The soft jazz notes blended perfectly with the peaceful night, giving him a sense of ease he hadn't felt in a long time. David's thoughts drifted to his family. He imagined Sarah waiting for him at home, her smile lighting up the room as he walked through the door. He thought of Lucas, who would be eager to catch up, and Emily, who would undoubtedly want to show him her latest artwork. The anticipation of these small but precious moments filled him with warmth. As he turned onto Maple Street, he noticed how the streetlights illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows across the road. It was a familiar sight, one that reminded him of countless late-night drives home from work or after a family outing. But just as David began to relax, the unexpected happened. The sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. David frowned, glancing at the flashing lights. A police car was behind him, signaling for him to pull over. Confused but compliant, David slowed his car and eased it to the side of the road. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He lowered the window and waited, his heart pounding slightly in his chest. The officer approached, his flashlight cutting through the darkness and landing on David's face. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone harsh and suspicious. David nodded, reaching for his wallet and handing over his documents. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. The officer eyed him critically. "You were driving slowly, almost like you were casing the neighborhood. Where are you headed?" David frowned slightly but kept his composure. "Just came from the grocery store," he replied. "Heading home to my family." The officer's suspicion didn't seem to lessen. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. David's military training kicked in. He knew when to comply to avoid escalation. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. The officer's demeanor grew more aggressive, and David found himself being forced against the hood of his car. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists, and he felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Just moments ago, he had been driving home, anticipating the warmth of his family. Now, he was being treated like a criminal. A few neighbors had begun to gather on the sidewalk, their murmurs of confusion growing louder. David remained calm, his years of military discipline guiding him. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. After everything he had done for his country, this was how he was being treated. Despite the sting of humiliation, he kept his composure, refusing to let the situation get the better of him. "What's going on here?" a voice called out from the growing crowd. David turned his head slightly, catching sight of concerned faces, their expressions a mix of confusion and empathy. The officer ignored the crowd, tightening his grip on David's arm. But before the situation could escalate any further, another set of headlights approached, and a second police car pulled up. Out stepped Officer Jessica Morales, her gaze immediately taking in the scene before her. The officer, the restrained man, and the uneasy crowd. "Walker, what's going on here?" Morales asked, her voice carrying a tone of authority that demanded an answer. The officer barely glanced at her. "This guy was acting suspicious," he muttered. "Didn't comply fast enough." Morales took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked at David, a man who stood tall despite the situation, his expression composed. Something about the scene didn't sit right with her. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" she asked David, her voice steady. David met her gaze, his eyes calm. "Colonel David Lawson, United States Army," he replied evenly. Morales's eyes widened slightly, recognition flashing across her face. She turned to the officer beside her. "Walker, take those cuffs off. Now." The officer hesitated, clearly taken aback. "What?" "He was." "Now," Morales repeated, her tone brooking no argument. Reluctantly, the officer removed the cuffs, and David rubbed his wrists, the cold bite of the metal still lingering. He looked at Morales, who gave him an apologetic nod. "I'm truly sorry for this, Colonel Lawson," she said, her voice sincere. "This shouldn't have happened." David nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Officer Morales. I just want to get home to my family." Morales gave him a small, understanding smile. "Of course. Let's get you on your way." As David got back into his car, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the night. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that lingered. He was almost home, almost back to the comfort of his family, but the events of the night had left a mark, a reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead, even in the place he called home. The flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror caught David off guard. A police car signaled him to pull over. Confused, but compliant, David eased his car to the side of the road. He lowered his window and waited, his military discipline keeping him calm. His heart pounded slightly, but his instincts told him to remain composed. Officer Brian Walker approached with a stern expression. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone harsh and impatient. David handed over his documents without hesitation. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked politely, his voice steady despite the confusion stirring within him. Walker eyed David suspiciously. "You were driving slowly, almost like you were casing the neighborhood. Where are you headed?" David frowned slightly, taken aback by the officer's insinuation, but he kept his voice calm. "I just came from the grocery store," he explained. "I'm heading home to my family." Walker's suspicion seemed to intensify, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to find something incriminating in David's demeanor. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. David, sensing the tension and knowing better than to argue, chose to comply. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible the entire time. He understood the importance of remaining non-threatening in situations like this. However, the situation quickly escalated as Walker's demeanor grew increasingly aggressive. Before David knew it, he was being pushed against the hood of his car, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. A wave of disbelief washed over David. He had faced many challenging situations during his years in the military, but nothing quite like this. The indignity of being treated like a criminal when all he wanted was to get home to his family was almost too much to bear. The murmurs of confusion and concern from the small crowd that had started to gather on the sidewalk only added to the surreal nature of the moment. "What's going on?" a woman's voice called out, her tone laced with worry. David turned his head slightly, catching sight of the concerned faces of his neighbors. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and empathy. David's training and discipline kept him from reacting emotionally. He wasn't angry, at least, not in a way that would make him lose control. He was disappointed. After everything he had done for his country, after all the sacrifices he had made, this was how he was being treated? But he refused to let the situation get the better of him. He stayed calm, his expression one of quiet endurance. The officer tightened his grip on David's arm, oblivious to the growing discomfort of the crowd. But before the tension could escalate any further, the sound of another car approaching cut through the night. A second police car pulled up, its headlights illuminating the scene. Officer Jessica Morales stepped out of the patrol car, her gaze quickly assessing the situation. The aggressive posture of Officer Walker, the restrained man against the car, and the uneasy crowd gathering around them. Something didn't sit right with her. "Walker, what's going on here?" Morales asked, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that demanded an answer. Walker barely glanced at her. "This guy was acting suspicious," he muttered, his grip on David not loosening. "Didn't comply fast enough." Morales frowned, taking a step closer. She studied David, his posture, his expression, the quiet dignity with which he held himself despite the situation. She knew something was wrong. The man before her was not behaving like someone with ill intentions. There was a steadiness to him, a sense of discipline that Morales recognized. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" she asked David, her tone measured and respectful. David met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Colonel David Lawson, United States Army," he replied evenly, his voice carrying the weight of his experience and identity. Morales's eyes widened slightly, recognition flashing across her face. She turned back to Walker, her expression hardening. "Walker, take those cuffs off." "Now." Walker hesitated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What?" "He was." "Now," Morales repeated, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Walker removed the handcuffs, the metal clinking as they came off David's wrists. David rubbed his wrists, the cold bite of the metal still lingering on his skin. He looked at Morales, who gave him an apologetic nod. "I'm truly sorry for this, Colonel Lawson," Morales said, her voice sincere. "This shouldn't have happened." David nodded, his expression softening slightly. He could see the genuine regret in her eyes. "Thank you, Officer Morales. I just want to get home to my family," he said, his voice carrying a note of exhaustion. Morales gave him a small, understanding smile. "Of course. Let's get you on your way." As David got back into his car, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the quiet of the night. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that still lingered. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and the sense of peace he had felt earlier was now overshadowed by the harsh reality of what had just happened. David started the engine, the soft jazz still playing on the radio, though it no longer brought him the same comfort. He glanced in his rearview mirror, seeing Officer Morales speaking sternly to Walker, her face set in a look of disapproval. It was a small consolation, but it reminded him that there were still good people willing to do the right thing. As he drove away, David's thoughts turned to his family. He knew Sarah would be worried. He was already late, and this incident had only delayed him further. He thought of Lucas and Emily, and how they looked up to him as a symbol of strength and integrity. He couldn't let them see him broken or disillusioned by this experience. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, led soldiers through battles, and made decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. Yet, here in his own country, in the place he called home, he faced a different kind of challenge, one that couldn't be fought with strategy or strength alone. It required patience, resilience, and the hope that things could change. David turned onto his street, the familiar row of houses coming into view. The porch light was on, and through the window, he could see Sarah pacing, her silhouette a comforting sight. He pulled into the driveway, turning off the engine and taking a moment to gather himself. Tonight had been a reminder, a stark, painful reminder, that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. But as David stepped out of the car and walked toward his front door, he knew he had to keep going. For his family, for his community, and for every person who had faced what he had faced tonight. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all of them. Sarah opened the door before he even reached it, her eyes filled with concern. "David, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. David managed to smile, pulling her into a gentle hug. "I'm home," he said simply, his voice tired but determined. And as he held her close, he knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he was ready to face it, with his family by his side. Officer Jessica Morales arrived on the scene, responding to a call for backup. Jessica was known in the department for her fairness and level-headed approach. As soon as she stepped out of her patrol car, she noticed something was off. The tension in the air was palpable, and the way Officer Walker was handling the situation didn't sit right with her. "Walker, what's going on here?" Jessica asked, her voice calm but authoritative. She approached slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Colonel David Lawson, pinned against his own car, with handcuffs biting into his wrists. There was a crowd forming, their murmurs of concern growing louder by the second. Walker barely glanced at her, his stance rigid. This guy was acting suspicious. "Didn't comply fast enough," he muttered, his voice defensive. Jessica studied David for a moment. His demeanor was far from threatening. He stood with the unmistakable posture of a military man, tall, composed, and dignified. There was no sign of resistance or aggression. She turned her attention to the crowd, noting the expressions of confusion and worry etched across their faces. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, and her instincts told her that Walker was overstepping. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Jessica asked David, her tone measured and respectful. She made a point of meeting his eyes, offering him a chance to speak for himself. David looked back at her, his gaze steady. "Colonel David Lawson, United States Army," he said evenly, his voice carrying both authority and exhaustion. Jessica's eyes widened slightly as recognition flashed across her face. She turned back to Walker, her expression hardening. "Walker, take those cuffs off. Now," she ordered, her voice unwavering. Walker hesitated, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" "He was." "I said now," Jessica repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Walker, daring him to defy her order. Reluctantly, Walker removed the handcuffs, the metal clinking as they came off David's wrists. The moment they were released, David rubbed his wrists, the cold bite of the metal still lingering. His face remained calm, but there was a deep-seated disappointment in his eyes that Jessica could not ignore. "I'm truly sorry for this, Colonel Lawson," Jessica said, her voice sincere. "This shouldn't have happened. You have my word that I'll make sure this situation is addressed properly." David nodded, appreciating her sincerity. "Thank you, Officer Morales. I just want to get home to my family," he said, his voice betraying a hint of the exhaustion he felt. Jessica turned to the crowd, raising her hands slightly in a gesture meant to calm them. "Thank you, everyone. Please head home. We'll take care of this," she said firmly. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the night as they turned to leave. Jessica watched until the street was mostly clear, then turned her attention back to David. She could see the strain in his eyes, the weariness that came not just from this incident, but from years of service and sacrifice. "I can't imagine how frustrating this must be," Jessica said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "I want you to know that not all of us are like Walker. I'm going to make sure that the right thing is done here." David offered a small, tired smile. "I appreciate that, Officer Morales. I know there are good people out there. It's just hard sometimes to remember that when moments like this happen." Jessica nodded, her expression one of understanding. "I get it, and you have every right to feel that way. But I promise, I'll do everything in my power to make sure justice is served." David gave her a nod of gratitude. "Thank you. I'm just trying to get home to my wife and kids. That's all that matters to me right now." Jessica took a step back, giving him space. "Of course. Let's get you on your way," she said, her voice gentle. David got back into his car, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he closed the door behind him. He started the engine, the soft hum of the jazz station still playing on the radio. He glanced out the window, watching as Officer Morales turned back to Walker, her face set in a stern expression. She was speaking to him, her voice too low for David to hear, but her posture made it clear she was not pleased. As David drove away, he felt a mix of emotions: relief at being free of the situation, gratitude for Officer Morales' intervention, but also a lingering sadness. He had spent years serving his country, fighting for the freedoms of others, yet here he was, treated with suspicion simply because of his appearance. It was a harsh reminder of the challenges that still existed, even in the place he called home. But tonight, there had also been a glimmer of hope, a reminder that there were people willing to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. As he turned onto his street, David focused on that hope, letting it carry him the rest of the way home. He knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew that there were allies like Jessica Morales who were willing to fight alongside him. And for now, that was enough. The following day, a video of the incident, recorded by a bystander, went viral. The footage showed David's calm demeanor in the face of Officer Walker's aggression, and it quickly gained traction online. The community of Greenwood, typically quiet and peaceful, was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. News outlets picked up the story, and social media buzzed with outrage. The video highlighted not only David's composed response, but also the unfair treatment he faced simply for driving home. Comments poured in from people across the country, expressing anger, sympathy, and support. The footage struck a nerve. It was a stark reminder that these incidents were not isolated, and people were tired of seeing injustice go unchecked. Protests began to form outside the police station, with residents demanding accountability. Signs reading, "Justice for all" and "End racial profiling" were held high as people gathered to voice their concerns. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, but it was also hopeful. People were united, determined to make a change. The incident had struck a chord, and the town's residents were not willing to stay silent. David watched the news coverage from his living room. His family gathered around him. His son, Lucas, was visibly upset, his hands clenched into fists as he sat on the edge of the couch. "Dad, you can't just let this go. People need to know what happened. They need to hear it from you," Lucas said, his voice filled with both anger and determination. David placed a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder, his own emotions simmering beneath the surface. "I know, son," he said gently, "but it's important that we handle this the right way. This isn't about revenge. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." He glanced at his wife, Sarah, who gave him a supportive nod. She understood the weight of his words, the careful balance he was trying to maintain. After a long night of reflection, David decided to speak publicly. He knew that his story could help bring about change, not just for himself but for others who had faced similar injustices. It wasn't an easy decision. He was a private man, and the idea of standing in front of cameras, exposing himself to the world, was daunting. But he also knew that staying silent was no longer an option. The next day, a press conference was arranged at the community center. The room was packed with journalists, local residents, and supporters who had come to hear David speak. Cameras flashed, and the hum of whispered conversations filled the air as David stepped up to the podium. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room before he began. "I am not here to condemn anyone," David started, his voice steady and resolute, "but to shed light on an issue that affects many people in this country. What happened to me was wrong, but it's part of a larger problem. We need to address the biases that lead to these situations. I've served this country to protect the rights of every citizen, and that includes the right to be treated with dignity and respect." The room was silent, every eye fixed on David. He spoke from the heart, sharing not just what had happened the previous night, but also the emotions it had stirred within him, the disappointment, the sadness, but also the hope. He spoke about his time in the military, the sacrifices he and countless others had made to defend the freedoms that everyone deserved. And he spoke about his desire for a future where his children, Lucas and Emily, would never have to face what he had faced. "This isn't just about me," David continued, his voice carrying across the room. "It's about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, who has ever felt the sting of prejudice. It's about ensuring that our community, our country, lives up to the ideals we claim to hold dear. We cannot turn a blind eye to these issues any longer. We must face them, together, and work towards meaningful change." A ripple of applause began, growing steadily until the room was filled with the sound of people showing their support. David took a step back from the podium, his heart pounding, but a sense of calm washing over him. He had done what he needed to do. He had spoken his truth, and now it was up to the community, to everyone listening, to take action. Outside the community center, the protest continued, but the mood had shifted. There was still anger, still frustration, but there was also a sense of purpose. People were no longer just protesting. They were organizing. Meetings were being planned, petitions drafted, and conversations started about how to improve police training and ensure accountability. Officer Jessica Morales, who had intervened during the incident, watched David's speech from the back of the room. She felt a swell of respect for him, for his courage, his composure, and his commitment to change. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be resistance and setbacks, but she was determined to be part of the solution. Later that evening, as David sat with his family, he felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. Lucas looked at him, his eyes filled with admiration. "You did the right thing, Dad," he said, his voice soft. "You stood up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." David smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "That's all I ever wanted, Lucas. To make things better, not just for us, but for everyone." The night ended on a note of quiet determination. The fight was far from over, but David knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, his community, and people like Officer Morales by his side. And together, they would keep pushing forward, one step at a time, towards a better, more just future. In the weeks that followed, Greenwood found itself at the heart of a movement. The incident involving David had sparked important conversations about policing and community relations. Town meetings were held, where residents voiced their concerns and shared their own experiences. David attended each meeting, listening intently and offering his perspective as both a veteran and a concerned citizen. The local community center became the epicenter of these discussions. People of all backgrounds, young and old, longtime residents and newcomers, came together, united by a shared desire for change. They spoke openly about their fears, their anger, and their hopes for a better future. David felt the power of these collective voices, each one adding to the momentum that was growing stronger every day. Officer Brian Walker was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted. The department faced scrutiny, and people demanded transparency. The pressure was on, and it was clear that the old ways of doing things were no longer acceptable. Meanwhile, Officer Jessica Morales emerged as an unexpected ally to David. She reached out to him, expressing her desire to work together to improve the relationship between the police department and the community. "We need to rebuild trust," Jessica told David during one of their meetings at the community center. Her eyes were earnest, her voice resolute. "I know not everyone in the department sees it this way, but I want to make a difference. We can't keep ignoring the problem." David nodded, appreciating her honesty. "Change starts with conversations like this," he agreed. "It's not going to be easy, but it's necessary." He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but it had to start somewhere, and this was as good a place as any. Together, David and Jessica began organizing workshops and training sessions for the local police force, focusing on de-escalation tactics and cultural sensitivity. They invited experts to lead the sessions, individuals who could provide insight and real-life experiences that would resonate with the officers. The workshops were challenging, and not everyone was receptive at first. Some officers resisted, their skepticism evident in their crossed arms and guarded expressions. But slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Jessica led by example, openly engaging in the discussions and encouraging her colleagues to do the same. She spoke about her own experiences as a Latina officer, the challenges she had faced, and the importance of understanding the community they served. David shared his story, not just of the incident with Walker but of his time in the military, of what it meant to serve and protect, not just in words, but in actions. David also spoke at local schools, sharing his story with students and encouraging young people to stand up for what is right, but to do so with respect and integrity. He visited classrooms, where students listened intently as he described the incident and the changes it had inspired. He emphasized the importance of empathy, of seeing one another as human beings first and foremost. "We all have a role to play," he told them. "Whether it's standing up against injustice or simply treating others with kindness, every action matters." The movement gained momentum, and soon, Neighboring towns began to take notice. Greenwood was becoming an example of how a community could come together to address difficult issues head-on. The changes didn't happen overnight, but progress was being made, one conversation, one workshop, and one act of understanding at a time. People were beginning to believe that things could be different, that they could be better. Local businesses began to show their support as well. Storefronts displayed signs reading, "We stand for justice," and "Together for change." Community leaders organized fundraisers to support initiatives aimed at fostering better relationships between law enforcement and residents. It wasn't just about reacting to what had happened. It was about building something positive out of it, creating lasting change that would benefit everyone. David found himself busier than he had ever been since returning home, but it was a different kind of busy, one that filled him with purpose. He spent his days meeting with community members, planning events, and working with Jessica and others who had joined their cause. There were setbacks, of course. Not everyone was on board, and there were moments when progress seemed slow, almost non-existent. But David reminded himself, and those around him, that real change took time. It took persistence, even when the path forward wasn't clear. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and planning, David stood outside the community center, watching as the last of the attendees filed out. Jessica walked up beside him, her expression tired but hopeful. "We're making a difference, David," she said, her voice quiet. "It's not always easy to see, but I know we are." David nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I think so too," he replied. He looked at Jessica, a sense of gratitude washing over him. "I couldn't have done this without you. Without everyone who's stepped up." Jessica smiled, a glimmer of determination in her eyes. "We're all in this together. And we're not done yet." David knew she was right. There was still so much work to be done. So many hearts and minds to reach, so many barriers to break down. But he also knew that they had taken the first steps, and that was what mattered most. Greenwood was changing, slowly but surely, and it was because people had decided that they could no longer stand by and watch. They had chosen to act, to speak out, and to come together in the face of adversity. As David walked to his car that night, he felt a sense of hope that was becoming more familiar with each passing day. The road ahead was long, but it was a road worth traveling. And with people like Jessica, Lucas, Sarah, and the entire community of Greenwood by his side, David knew they would continue moving forward, one step at a time, towards a future where justice, understanding, and compassion were not just ideals, but realities. Months after the incident, Officer Brian Walker requested a meeting with David. Initially, David was hesitant, unsure of Walker's intentions. But after some thought, he agreed. They met at the community center, the same place where David had spoken out months earlier. The air was thick with anticipation, and the weight of what was about to unfold seemed to hang in the room. Walker entered, his posture no longer that of an authoritative officer but of a man carrying the burden of his actions. He looked at David, his eyes filled with remorse. "Colonel Lawson, I want to apologize," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I let my biases cloud my judgment that night. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry for what I put you through." David studied Walker for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. Walker's eyes were earnest, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of his regret. After a pause, David nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Walker. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Walker nodded, his expression sincere. "I know. I've been attending the workshops, and they've opened my eyes. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. I'm committed to doing better." David extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Walker shook it. It wasn't a moment of forgiveness, but of understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the need for change. The past couldn't be changed, but the future could be shaped by the choices they made moving forward. In the months that followed, Walker became an active participant in the community initiatives. He worked alongside Jessica Morales and David, helping to bridge the gap between the police and the residents of Greenwood. It wasn't easy. Many in the community were still skeptical of his intentions, their mistrust lingering like a shadow. But Walker was determined to prove that he had changed, not just with words but with actions. He attended every workshop, often sitting quietly in the back, listening as community members shared their experiences. He heard stories of fear, of pain, of moments where trust had been broken. Walker knew that he couldn't erase the past, but he could help rebuild what had been shattered. Slowly, he began to engage more, answering questions, participating in discussions, and even sharing his own story of how he was learning to confront his own biases. Jessica stood by his side throughout it all, her unwavering belief in change serving as a guiding light. She could see the difference in Walker. He was no longer defensive or dismissive. He was open, willing to listen and to learn. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that Walker's journey was a testament to what was possible when people chose to grow. David continued to speak out, not just in Greenwood but across the state. He was invited to share his story at town halls, schools, and police departments. His message was clear. Change is possible, but it requires courage, accountability, and a willingness to listen. He spoke of his own experiences, of the community's resilience, and of the importance of coming together to address the systemic issues that had plagued their society for too long. One evening, after a long day of meetings, David returned home to find Sarah and the kids waiting for him. They had set up a small celebration, a simple family dinner, complete with candles and David's favorite meal. As they sat down together, David felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but it had also been meaningful. They had come so far, and they were still moving forward. Lucas looked at his father, admiration in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I did what I had to do, son. For you, for Emily, for everyone who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." He reached across the table, taking Sarah's hand. She gave him a warm smile, her eyes filled with love and understanding. Across town, Walker was also finding his own path to redemption. He had begun visiting local schools, speaking to students about his experiences and the lessons he had learned. It wasn't easy. Standing in front of young people, admitting his mistakes, made him feel vulnerable. But it was also necessary. He wanted them to understand the importance of empathy, of questioning their own biases, and of treating every person with respect. During one of these visits, a young student raised her hand. "Officer Walker, why did you change?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Walker paused, considering his answer. "Because I realized that I was wrong," he said honestly. "I realized that the way I was treating people wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. I hurt people, and I don't want to be that kind of person. I want to be someone who helps, not someone who harms." The student nodded, and Walker could see a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. It was moments like these that made all the difficulty worth it. Moments where he could see that change was taking root, even if it was just one person at a time. The community of Greenwood continued to evolve. Trust was not something that could be rebuilt overnight, but progress was being made. David and Jessica worked tirelessly, organizing more workshops, bringing in experts, and encouraging open dialogue. The community center was often filled with people, residents, officers, young and old, all coming together to share their stories and learn from one another. One day, during a particularly emotional town hall meeting, an elderly resident stood up. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I've lived in Greenwood my whole life," she said, "and I've seen a lot of things. But I've never seen people come together like this. It gives me hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we can leave something better for our children." The room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of applause filled the space. David looked around, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. This was what it was all about, coming together, understanding each other, and building a community where everyone felt safe and valued. Walker, who was standing at the back of the room, felt a lump rise in his throat. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he also knew he was on the right path. He caught David's eye across the room, and David gave him a nod, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of shared understanding, and of hope for the future. As the meeting concluded, David approached Walker. "You did good today," he said, his voice genuine. "This is what it's all about. Showing up, listening, and being willing to change. Walker smiled, a sense of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, Colonel Lawson. I'm trying my best, and I won't stop." David placed a hand on Walker's shoulder. "None of us will. We're in this together." The road to redemption and reconciliation was long, but it was a journey worth taking. David, Walker, Jessica, and the entire community of Greenwood were proof that change was possible. It required patience, humility, and a willingness to confront the past, but it also brought with it the promise of a better future, one where justice, compassion, and understanding were at the heart of everything they did. And for David, that was all he had ever wanted. Not just for himself, but for his family, his community, and for every person who deserved to live in a world where they were treated with dignity and respect. The changes in Greenwood were evident. The police department had implemented new policies, focusing on community engagement and accountability. Officer Jessica Morales had been promoted to lead a newly established community relations division, a role that recognized her dedication and vision. David was invited to serve as an advisor, helping to shape the training programs for new recruits and ensuring that empathy and understanding were at the core of their education. The relationship between the police and the residents of Greenwood had improved significantly. There were still challenges to overcome, but the foundation had been laid for a better, more understanding community. People were talking to each other, listening, and learning, and that, in itself, was a real victory. It was a slow process, but the progress was undeniable. The air of distrust that had once filled the streets of Greenwood was now being replaced by a sense of hope and mutual respect. At a town gathering held at the community center, David stood before his neighbors once again. This time, there was no tension, no fear, just hope and a shared determination to keep moving forward. The room was packed with familiar faces, and the energy was different, lighter, filled with anticipation for what they could accomplish together. "We've come a long way," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "But our work isn't over. We must continue to stand up for what is right, to hold each other accountable, and to build a community where everyone feels safe and respected. Together, we can create a future where stories like mine are no longer necessary, because everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces filled with hope and determination. As David looked out at the people of Greenwood, his friends, his family, his community, he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, but it was a journey worth taking. Greenwood was no longer just a town. It was a symbol of what was possible when people came together for a common purpose. Officer Morales stepped up beside David, her eyes shining with pride. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've shown that change is possible, but we must keep pushing forward. This community deserves our best, and we're going to keep giving it." People nodded in agreement, the energy in the room palpable. There was something deeply moving about seeing law enforcement and residents standing side by side, united in their mission to create a better future. It wasn't just about new policies or programs. It was about changing the culture, about creating a space where everyone felt they belonged. After the gathering, David walked out of the community center with Sarah by his side. She looked at him, her eyes filled with admiration. "I'm so proud of you, David," she said softly. "You've done so much, not just for our family, but for this entire community." David smiled, pulling her close. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. "You've been my rock through all of this." He looked around, seeing neighbors chatting with officers, children playing nearby, and a sense of normalcy returning to the community. This is what it's all about, isn't it? Making sure our kids grow up in a place where they feel safe, where they're treated with respect. Sarah nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. "It's everything," she whispered. Across the street, Lucas and Emily were laughing with some friends. David watched them for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. He wanted a future for them that was free from fear and prejudice, a future where they could thrive, where their potential would not be limited by the biases of others. As they made their way home, David noticed Officer Walker speaking with a group of teenagers. Walker's posture was relaxed, his demeanor open and friendly. The teens seemed at ease, asking questions, and Walker was listening intently, nodding as they spoke. It was a small scene, but it was significant. Evidence that the change they had all worked for was taking root, one interaction at a time. David approached Walker, a smile on his face. "Looks like you're making some new friends," he said, his tone light. Walker looked up, returning the smile. "Just trying to do my part, Colonel," he replied. "These kids have a lot to say, and I think it's time we start listening more." David nodded, feeling a sense of pride in the man standing before him. Walker had come a long way since that fateful night, and his journey was a testament to the power of redemption and the willingness to change. "Keep it up, Brian. This is how we build a better future, one conversation at a time." Walker extended his hand, and David shook it firmly. There was no longer any hesitation between them, just a shared understanding of the work that lay ahead and the commitment to seeing it through. As David and Sarah continued their walk home, they passed by several homes with signs that read "Together for Change" and "Justice for All." It was a reminder of how far they had come, of the strength that lay in unity. The people of Greenwood had faced a moment of crisis, and instead of allowing it to divide them, they had chosen to come together, to heal, and to grow. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, David looked at each of them: Sarah, Lucas, Emily. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the love and support that had carried him through the toughest moments. They had faced challenges, but they had faced them together, and that made all the difference. "We're building something special here," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us. This is our home, and we're making it better, together." Lucas raised his glass of lemonade, a grin on his face. "To a brighter future," he said. Everyone raised their glasses, clinking them together. "To a brighter future," they echoed, their voices filled with hope and determination. And for the first time in a long time, David felt truly at peace. He had come home, not just to a place, but to a community that was ready to stand together, to fight for justice, and to build a brighter future for all. The journey wasn't over, but it was well underway, and David knew that as long as they continued to walk this path together, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish.